こんばんは。本日は、
Good
SPF、
evening.
IFAT 合同セミナー
Thank
を
you
ご
very
視聴いただ
much
きあり
for
がとうございま
joining
す。
the joint webinar hosted by
この
SPF
ウェビナーは緊
and
急に開催
IFAT.
することを決めたもので
At
す。
short notice, we
ロ
decided
シ
to
アのウ
hold
クライナ
this
侵攻と
webinar.
いう事象は、
The
世界
phenomenon
秩
of
序を変
Russia's
えかねない出来
invasion
事である
into
という認識の
Ukraine
もと、
can shake
ヨー
the
ロッパ、
global
特にウクラ
order,
イナと国
and
境を接す
Europe,
る中
especially
央ヨーロッパ
countries
の国
of
々の、
Central Europe
こ
that
の事
share
象に対
borders
する
with
見方、
Ukraine
考え方を私たち
are
は直
actually
接、
stakeholders, and
そ
this
ういっ
is a
た
good
国々の
opportunity
方
for
々
us to
の声
listen
を聞
to
き
their
たいと
true
思ったわけ
voices
です。
directly. And that
日
is the
本と
reason
ヨーロッパ
behind
は世
planning
界
for
秩
this
序を変更
webinar.
するような試みに対し
Japan
て
and
協
Europe
力し
is
て当たらねば
strongly
なりません。
against any
その意
attempt
味
to
で
change
本
the
日の
status quo and
ウェビナー
international
が皆
order.
様
We
の
must
ご理
cooperate,
解
and
を
therefore we
深める
truly
のに
hope that
役立て
this
ば
seminar will be
大
helpful
変嬉し
in
く思い
deepening
ます。
your understanding towards
IFAT は
the
ハンガリー
situation.
のシンクタンクであ
IFAT
り、
is a Hungarian think tank.
Institute for
It
Foreign
stands for
Affairs and
Institute for
Trade
Foreign
の
Affairs and
略です。
Trade.
非常に外交安全保障、そして経済に
They
も
have
深い造形
experts
を有するシンク
in
タンクですので、
diplomacy,
本日
security, as well
は
as
非常
in
に深い議
economic
論ができ
affairs.
るもの
So
と期
I am
待しており
confident
ます。
that we will be
それでは
able to
最初
have a
に
meaningful
両
discussion.
シンクタンクからご挨拶を申し上げま
On
す。
behalf
最
of
初に
the two
笹
think
川平
tanks,
和財団の
opening
茶野
remarks will
常
be
務理事から
delivered
ご挨
first.
拶を申し上げます。
Ms. Chano,
茶野常務理
Executive
事、よろし
Director
く
of
お願いいたしま
Sasakawa
す。
Peace Foundation, will deliver her opening remarks. Thank you. Friends in Europe, good morning, and participants in Japan, good evening. Despite the short notice, thank you for joining the webinar co-hosted by Sasakawa Peace Foundation and Hungarian representative think tank IFAT Institute for Foreign Affairs and Trade on Ukraine crisis and international prospects. Sasakawa Peace Foundation has indicated our strong remorse on the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which is an infringement of a nation's sovereignty and territory, and strong, serious violation of international law that bans use of force, as well as the UN Charter. We strongly demand that the human rights of the civilians in Ukraine who are put into harsh circumstances be protected. This unilateral aggression by Russia, as mentioned by Mr. Ohara, may shake the foundation of international order that has been well established after World War II. Therefore, at the Security Research Group of Sasakawa Peace Foundation 1 week ago, decided to hold this webinar. Despite the short preparatory period, I thank the colleagues at IFAT who have agreed to co-organize this seminar. And at the SPF, it's not just the researchers, but also the staff who put in enormous efforts for the preparations. But even during that short period of time, the situation on the ground has become even more difficult. Hungary shares borders with Ukraine, but it's not just Europe, but in the Indo-Pacific, there is heightened sense of crisis. Until Tuesday, I was in Okinawa, but my colleagues I met in Okinawa were focusing on Ukraine, and they were also seeking an analogy with Taiwan contingency. Experts of foreign affairs, military affairs, and security affairs from each of their perspectives will share their views on the Ukrainian situation as well as its impact to Europe and the Indo-Pacific. We truly hope that the situation is resolved and subdued as expeditiously as possible. And today happens to be the 11th anniversary of the earthquake and tsunami that occurred in 2011. It's truly heart-wrenching to think that there are still those who are in evacuation and suffering from the agony of the nuclear power station accident and the earthquake. And that overlaps with the images from Ukraine. And Russia has implied threat of use of nuclear weapon. And as the only country to have suffered atomic bombings, it is impermissible. It will be a short 1 hour, but I am hopeful that we will be able to have an extremely meaningful discussion. Thank you once again for your
茶
cooperation.
野常務理事、ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. That was
のダイ
Mr.
レク
Junko
ターであ
Chano,
る
Executive
ドクター
Director
マー
of
トン・ウグロ
SPF.
ス
We'd
ティ
like
か
to ask
らご挨拶をいただきます。
Dr. Martin
ドクター・グロ
Ugrosky,
スティ、よろしくお
Director
願いいた
of
します。
IFAT, to deliver opening remarks.
Thank you, Hara-sensei, for the kind introduction. I'm also grateful to Director Chano for supporting our event today. These are perilous times that we're facing right now, and fortunately for us, the pandemic allowed for the organization of this event. During regular times, it would be impossible to have this conversation today, but due to the widespread nature of online conferences, we were able to react very quickly. And as I can see, the interest on both sides towards the conversation is really high, and we're about to meet the expectations. About 2 weeks ago, Russia invaded Ukraine, and that put Hungary on the front line of the conflict because we're a neighboring country. And the response of both the Hungarian government and the Hungarian people has been very encouraging. We do stand by our friends and allies in NATO and the European Union, condemning the attack and supporting the sanctions against Russia in order to de-escalate the situation. On the other hand, what is really remarkable is the unity of the Hungarian people helping Ukrainian refugees crossing the border. Over the course of the 2 weeks, more than 200,000 people came through the border seeking shelter from the war. Obviously, Poland is having the most of the burden with more than 1 million people who have entered their borders. But all of the countries on the front lines are doing what they have to. And I think the European response to the crisis, both in the humanitarian side and also on the political side, has been very reassuring. Europe and NATO stands united against the invasion of Ukraine. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today. Obviously, we have great experts from both sides, and I'm more than eager to listen to the Japanese perspective as well. And as Director Chano highlighted, these are very interesting times and very important times, testing the credibility, the willingness and the resolve of democratic countries, also when it comes to the possible implications and spillover effects to the Taiwan issue. So I'm very looking forward to learn more about this during the course of the conference. Thank you very much. And Mr. O'Hara, back to you.
Dr. Grosty, ありがとうございました。
Dr. Grosty, thank you very much. Time is limited, so without further ado, we would like to begin the discussion. The first speaker is from Hungary, Program Manager and Senior Research Fellow of IFAT, Dr. Peter Stepper. Dr. Stepper, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to take part in this wonderful event with our very important strategic partner, Sasakawa Peace Foundation. So I would like to start with a short introduction stating and repeating the words of Director Grosdy that the 24th of February has been a very tragic day, and we are deeply sad that it brought back the days of using brute force in power politics. So in Hungary, we are all really sad to witness such an act, and as it was mentioned, being a country having common borders, we are deeply worried about the consequences, the strategic consequences, as well as the imminent humanitarian crisis as well. Our government was and is ready to provide humanitarian assistance for all the refugees coming from Ukraine, and we hope and we also support every kind of policy which helps to reinstate peace in the region in a short term. Unfortunately, we are a bit pessimistic about the prospects of quick solution, and even if we could witness the direct negotiation of the foreign ministers of the both parties yesterday in Turkey, we do not see any quick results and solutions for ending the military conflict soon. In my presentation, I would like to cover what we know so far on the, let's say, on the battleground. Secondly, I would like to show you how to assess the situation from European and Hungarian perspective, and what policies we in Hungary would like to support in a short term, and what kind of strategic implications we understand at this point from what we know. As a short disclaimer, I would like to say I'm not a military expert, rather a security policy expert focusing solely on NATO and Euro-Atlantic affairs. So I'm more interested generally in US foreign policy and security affairs. Nonetheless, as I presume all of the people around the world, I'm try to cover the news and understand what's going on in Ukraine on a daily basis. What we've known so far, and let's just have a brief summary of the events. Russia started the military operations from 6 major directions, from the northern part of the country, from Belarus in the direction of Kiev, the capital city, and to Chernihiv, and also another military operation against Kharkiv and Sumy, and less so strong forces, a bit surprisingly, attacking Ukrainian forces from Donetsk and Luhansk regions from the east. What we know so far, one of the most important area of these so-called Russian special operation, as President Putin calling it, is going on in the Crimean Peninsula, and it has some strategic implications. Because the Crimean territory is de facto in the hands of the Russians since 2014, had serious limitations. What we know, they did not have the necessary water supplies because the actual channels important for it remained in the hands of Ukrainian forces before these tragic events. So that's the one reason why it was very important for the Russians to control this territory, and it has a bit more, they were a lot more focused on this part of the country and the operation than, for example, in the eastern part of the country. What we know, and I hope my colleagues in the next presentations will help us out to understand what's really going on in the battlefield. But what we see, expectations from the Russian side, for example, they can reach the city of Mykolaiv, which will surrender in 1 or 2 days, did not happen so far. So Ukrainian forces could slow down the invasion from Russia, and even though they could march into the direction of Mariupol and try to join their forces coming from the eastern part of the country, from the Donetsk region, they couldn't move as fast as they or as we were expecting for the first sight. Obviously, in the southern part of Ukraine, Odessa is something like a crown jewel for the Russian forces to capture in the long run. But what we see, the Ukrainian forces fighting for defend Mykolaiv and other major logistical points makes it impossible to reach Odessa in a couple of weeks, but it can change very soon. As it was mentioned in the introduction, the whole world was very worried about what was going on in terms of Zaporizhia and the nuclear power plant, which could cause a serious nuclear accident. But it's also important to mention this actual strategic point was really important in the northern direction, and not just because of the energy supply, but also to be able to have a circle of Russian forces around the capital city of Kiev. I think what was really surprising for most of the security policy experts, that Russian forces, it seems, decided to move against the capital city of Ukraine. Kiev is a very large city consisting of 3.5 million inhabitants, and it's very hard to believe. The original goal of Russia was to capture such a large city and pacify it or hold for a longer time. We still not see it clearly what was the real plan here. Is it part of psychological warfare or something else? Because in a traditional military understanding, it's not necessarily the smartest move we can imagine from the Russian perspective. It is really hard to assess what is going on because, as we know, the Russians have most of the times as many scenarios as possible, and most of them are trying to be creative. They are within their best interest. Of course, there is the best possible scenario to invade the country and reach their strategic goals in a couple of days. And even if it not happen, there are plan B, plan C, plan D, and so on and so forth. So it's really hard to assess what are the goals and limits of Russian strategic thinking. And it would be important to know, because it would help us to make proper peace negotiations and to understand where are the limits and where are the possibilities to end and stop this war which is going on. Of course, the official communication from the Russian side, which is some kind of nonsense like denazifications or claim for territories in the region, it's really hard to understand. So we still do not know yet if they would like to see a change in terms of the government, because it's not so logical at this point. They have to agree with the government in Ukraine, and it seems to be logical to have an agreement with Volodymyr Zelensky being a legitimate and democratically elected leader of the country. So without Zelensky, it's hard to imagine a situation whom the Russians can agree on anything and everything which is sustainable solution for their strategic interest. Of course, there are hopes that they can achieve some limited strategic goals, which can lead to very tragic and bad scenarios, which we in Hungary and in Europe, all in European member states, would like to avoid. Seeing a solution having a de facto separated East and West Ukraine, one in a very tragic economic situation ruled by the Russians, and another which have prospects in the long term to join EU and other Euro-Atlantic integration formats. It would be the worst possible outcome from my perspective, because this strategic outcome would need years of fighting ahead of us, and it would severely damage the whole European economic structure. What we have so far and what we could assess, huge losses can be seen on both sides. Of course, there is a fight of narratives and an information war is going on, but I think it's important to see clearly the relevance of these strategic losses. On the Russian side, the losses are relevant because of the experience we know so far. Precision strikes and high-tech military strikes, as we used to see in case of US military operations, are not the same when Russians try to do it. So what we know, they are moving into a more traditional form of warfare, using main battle tanks, long logistical supply lines, having all the problems coming with it. So at this point so far, Ukrainians can say they can relatively cheaply and successfully can counter multi-million-dollar Russian main battle tanks with relatively cheap American Stinger missiles and other equipment, which is an advantage on the Ukrainian side. Of course, we can read the news about the importance of UAVs coming from Turkey and other Western partners, which also caused severe losses for Russian forces. But it's also quite clear that logistical supply lines for Russia to maintain is not so easy because of the long winter, because of the situation of the surface and all the problems attacking a very large and vast land of Ukraine. Of course, I wouldn't say surprisingly, but I would say I'm very happy to see how Europe and the whole transatlantic world was united in terms of the economic sanctions. So we can say Russia not just had very great losses in military terms, but far more problems on the economic basis. If we focus on the other side, there are obviously huge losses on the Ukrainian side either. I think it wouldn't be wise to say the traditional Russian military machine or war machine is less advanced. Of course, it's less advanced what we expected, but still more advanced as it is in the narrative of certain media outlets. I'm saying this because sometimes we refer to the T-62 battle tanks and other forces like being cold war archaic, very old equipment. But the case is these are modernized fourth generation battle tanks, and they still have some opportunities to reinforce their troops. I think the major question is how far the leadership in Russia will go in terms of going into this direction. So at this point, they are very, very dangerous and very committed to achieve their strategic goals. But I wouldn't say they do not have any possible reinforcements because they have. The question is if they are ready to use it, and the other question is how far the let's say civilian casualties will keep growing, because it's very sad to see in the first and early stage of the military conflict, the Russians were focusing on military targets exclusively, but nowadays we can read news about attacks against hospitals and other civilian infrastructure, which will and can cause a very severe humanitarian crisis. And to conclude with the last part, what is the European and Hungarian perspective about the situation, what we see? Militarily and politically speaking, NATO and the EU is an ironclad alliance, and Hungary is a country which is very committed of all of this alliance, the US and the West in general. So that's what we have done before, and that's what we expect to continue in our country. Economic side, it's much more complicated. It's very good to see the European Union could agree upon the first circle of first list of sanctions in a very early stage, and all the European countries supported them. But it's also very important to highlight or underline that all the attempts of energy sector diversifications of the last decades were very problematic, and not necessarily just because the countries and small states reliant on Russian gas sources. It was a failure because of the Nabucco pipeline project. It was a failure because of a bit of short-sightedness of German Energiewende project, which was pretty much easy to understand from the perspective of climate change. But today, it's really hard to see what it brings to us seeing the consequences of this Russian aggression. So Hungary, in terms of economic consequences, is in a very bad position. First of all, we are still recovering from the COVID situation economically, and we are still very much dependent on Russian energy sources, but we are not the only country in Europe to face with these consequences. Despite this situation with energy, Hungary rejected from the very early stage all the Russian claims on Crimean Peninsula and elsewhere in Ukraine, and we also support all the NATO efforts and in the EU efforts against the aggression. But there are some consequences we are really worried about. First and foremost, the Transcarpathian Hungarian minority, which will be in a very vulnerable position if we have an enduring military conflict in the upcoming years. And to be honest, we really do not see any short-term alternative path in terms of modernizing and opening the Paks 2 nuclear power plant in Hungary. And it's not just because the political connections or business connections with the Russian side, but also with the lack of real alternatives from the American, French, and other European companies. So at this point, it's really hard to see what will be the short-term solution for this problem. In the long run, I would expect a major shift in terms of European policies, and continue to be less dependent from Russia and more committed to alternative European and Western solution. So at this point, I would like to stop here and give the floor and opportunity to other speakers, but I'm, of course, always open to any questions and try to answer that.
Dr. Stepper, ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Dr. Stepper. From the Japanese side, former Lieutenant General who has been with Belgium and NATO as a uniformed officer, we would like to ask former Commandant Jun Nagashima for comments. Thank you very much, Ohara-san and Dr. Stepper. Thank you for the valuable comments. Your narrative was very comprehensive. In Japan, we don't get the big picture because we only get carved out snapshots of one battlefield. So thank you very much for giving us a comprehensive picture. 2008, Georgia, 2014, Crimea annexation. Russia's hybrid warfare was not so functional this time around. Maybe Ukraine or US and NATO backing Ukraine had made great efforts in order to prevent Russia's success in hybrid warfare. And that was unexpected on the part of Russia. And that has led to the lack of success or failure on the part of Russia. But let me speak from a slightly different perspective, from a Japanese perspective, and share with you what we can say about the phenomenon currently occurring in Ukraine. Can we have the slides? Japan and Hungary, we are distanced, but we share very long historical ties, and the friendship continues today. On the other hand, if we place Japan into the map of Europe, we are an archipelago, and due to such geographical attribute, in comparison to Hungary, which is part of a continent, the interest or security is low. Our archipelago is north and southward, but we are surrounded by China, Russia, and North Korea, who are attempting to change the status quo, which is a potential crisis. So Ukraine, aggression by Russia into Ukraine is an unilateral attempt to change the status quo. And this is extremely relevant to the security situation of Japan. And a big reason is China. On January 31st, at the UN meeting on Ukraine, China said NATO is a product of Cold War and criticized the West and supported the security initiative of Europe that was advocated by Russia. And in the Russo-Sino summit on the 4th of February, their collaboration, assuming Ukraine and the Taiwan Straits, was asserted. So, as indicated here, there's this comprehensive strategic partnership of cooperation between the two countries. And in 2021, joint naval drills have been conducted, and 10 warships conducted a joint patrol in the seas near Japan. And then in the airspace surrounding Japan, Chinese and Russian bombers flew joint patrol missions. So there are more joint drills increasing. What we need to consider is China and Russia strengthening its military cooperation, and that elevating the tension in East Asia, and in the end, reducing the presence of the United States in the Indo-Pacific. That's what we are concerned about. When we look back on Russia's demand to the Western country, it is to not acknowledge the sovereign equality that is written in the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, and to ban the redeployment of weapons that can strike Russia. And that in gist means not allowing the redeployment of intermediate nuclear forces in Europe by US through NATO. And NATO and Western countries are upholding their position not to yield to Russia's demands, and they are persistently seeking diplomatic resolution. And in the East Asian region, ensuring the reliability of the nuclear umbrella of the United States and responding to ballistic missile threat is a major security challenge, and Japan must resolutely respond to any demand that Russia makes. So in this context, US-Japan alliance must reaffirm the strategic and tactical vulnerability because, as I said, hybrid threat is further diversifying and is further increasing, and the response is extremely complicated and challenging. So Japan-US alliance must strengthen our defense capabilities in such area, and we need to elevate the resilience against cyber attack, energy weapons, and cognitive attack. China and Russia may combine non-military and military means on top of the economic security threat, and they may prepare very diverse and flexible attack means. And that being kept in mind, we have to further strengthen the solidarity between Japan and the US through the alliance, but not only that, but with Australia, ROK, and NATO partner countries, including Hungary. And we need to make such framework visible in this region. That concludes my comment. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you
ハ
very
ンガリ
much
ー
for
側、
that.
ドクター・ステッパーからハンガ
We
リー、あ
had
るい
the
は欧
Dr.
州からの、 今回の事象に対
Stepper
する見
about Hungary
方、そ
and
して展望を伺
European
い、
view and
長
perspectives
島さ
was
んから
given by
は、
Dr. Stepper, and
日本の
Lieutenant General Jun Nagashima
置
talked
かれてい
about
る状況を、
the position
今回
that
のウクライ
Japan
ナ情
finds
勢とも比
itself
較しながらお
and
話をいただきました。
comparing the situation
続い
to the
て、
situation in the
神保県
Ukraine.
慶応義塾
Next,
大
we
学
have
教授か
Professor Ken
ら、
Jimbo, professor at
こうした日
Keio
本の見方
University,
についてもさらに
who will
深い
be
お話をいただきたいと思い
talking
ます。
in depth
神
about
保教授、お
Japan's
願いいたします。
perspective. Over to you, sir, Professor Ken Jimbo. Thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this very valuable conference. At the outset, Ms. Chano, Executive Director, talked about the Russia-Ukraine war, which will be a watershed for the international situation. And there's a humanitarian situation arising there. And it's very hard to know what we should be thinking about, but an important question or important questions that should be sorted out as to why the incursion into into Ukraine by Russia, why could we not stop that? And the infantry units taking place. It's a very traditional infantry units which are taking place. And why is US and NATO unable to intervene directly and militarily? And why has the threat of using nuclear weapons been so effective? And how well will the unprecedented economic sanctions against Russia work? These questions are key elements that will shape the next phase of the security landscape. These are indeed very important. Time is rather short today, but from Japan's perspective, the Indo-Pacific region, what significance could this have? So I'd like to raise a few issues in this connection. If I were to raise the specific points, the largest focal point would be Taiwan, the Taiwan Strait deterrence structure. What changes would be brought into this? And I believe that this is a very important significance of this. The Russia-Ukraine war, if Russia through blitzkrieg could control Ukraine successfully within a short period of time. And if it had established a fait accompli, then for China, when unifying Taiwan, it would have been a reference point. However, but as you have seen, the very courageous Ukraine army and the citizens' resistance gave damage to Russia, and it is not making progress the way it planned. And that, I believe, is engraved in the minds of China, the Chinese leadership. The first lesson is that it's very difficult to wage a war when you underestimate your opponent. And secondly, what we have to think about seriously is that the United States and the allied countries in the Taiwan Strait crisis, what is the credibility that it would militarily intervene? And does this incident in Ukraine mean in this regard? Since the outset, Biden has denied he would send US troops to Ukraine. And naturally, militarily, what effect this would have would have to be separately discussed. But the no-fly zone has been rejected by NATO. And a few days ago, they have abandoned giving fighters, NATO fighters, to fighter planes to Ukraine, saying that they should not clash directly with Russia because it would escalate things enormously. And so there's a hesitancy with regard to military intervention. And so we could say that Russia through intimidation that it would cause a nuclear war. It is proving to be very effective in deterring the United States and other countries. This is very serious. The United States and Russia and NATO together could work to escalate this nuclear war, but it's Russia only that is saying that it will escalate to nuclear war. And bringing us back to the Taiwan issue, Ukraine and NATO is very different in terms of strategic environment and so forth. But the conventional strategies of China is very strong, along with that of Russia. And China also has nuclear weapons. And even if China poses the threat of using the nuclear threat, can we say that U.S. will fight through against this? And U.S.'s deterrence with regard to Taiwan is not comparable to Ukraine. Its deterrence is very strong, but Russia is giving the threat that it would go nuclear and to deter intervention by NATO. And then there's the issue of value solidarity. Japan, Australia, Korea, Singapore, and other countries have condemned and they have Russia, and they said that they would impose sanctions. But India and Vietnam at the UN General Assembly abstained from supporting the resolution. And the Quad, Japan, US, and Australia and India met, but they could not show the kind of solidarity that Europe and the United States showed. The Value Solidarity Foundation is very weak in Asia. I think this is what this demonstrates. In particular, India still is refraining from making a clear value judgment on Russia, has a negative impact on possible future maritime security cooperation in terms of countering a unilateral change of status quo by force. Prime Minister Kishida is scheduled to visit India this month. And so we hope that he will work to rebuild the rule-based order in formation in Asia. We hope that he will go a step further. And lastly, Japan, in terms of security, is now working on the security strategy and the defense program outline and the medium-term defense program. How to position Russia is a major issue. the security strategy came into being in 2013 in December to push forward with Japan, Russia on all fronts is very important for strategy for security in Japan. That is what it is stated. In 2013, Japan's security was focused on China, and to focus Japan's resources on China to achieve that, to stabilize relations with Russia was what Japan was attempting to do. That was in the background. Japan-Russia relations, if economic relations can be nurtured, when Russia looks at Asia, it would diversify economic interests and it would prevent Russia and China to have a common interests. And this was an attempt to try to separate Russia and China. Of course, separating Russia and China relations is maybe a pipe dream, but to complicate the relationship can perhaps be done. And it was the traditional, conventional thinking that as an extension of this Russia-Japanese peace treaty and resolution of the territorial disputes could be achieved. This policy toward Russia is currently undergoing fundamental review. The revision of the national security strategy later this year is certain to list Russia as a security concern. Japan can no longer expect Russia to act with restraint, and it is almost certain depending on the outcome of the situation in Ukraine, that Russia will carry out active military activities, deploy new equipment in the Far East region, as Mr. Nakashima said, and the Sino-Russian security cooperation will deepen further in the future, as Mr. Nakashima mentioned. Japan's security policy faces an even more challenging phase. Importantly, however, Hungary and other European countries' concerns about Russia and Japan's concerns about Russia have more areas of shared concern. And this is why Japan and Hungary should further discuss Russia's military assessment. And common policies, adopting common policies is something that we should deepen discussions about. Thank you very much.
はい、神保教授ありがとうございました。
Thank you very
視聴
much,
者の中
Professor
で、
Jimbo.
音が二重に聞こえる方がいらっしゃいま
Among
し
the
たら、
listeners, if you
言語
are
選択
having
のボタンから改め
difficulty
て
because
日
you're
本語
hearing
を選
the
択していただ
interpreting
き
and
た
the
いと
original
思
at
い
the
ます。
same time, please
す
select
で
the
に
appropriate
視聴者
language.
の皆
Please
様から
select
チャット
Japanese.
でいくつか質問をいただいておりま
We
すが、
already have questions from
次
the
にディスカッ
audience,
サントの
but
か
we
ら
have
コメントをいただいた後、こうした質問にお答
the
えしたい
next
と思います。
discussant who
で
will
は、
be giving his
IFAT
comment.
の
We
シニア
have
リサーチフェローである
IFAT
ドク
Senior
ター・ピー
Research
ター・ワグ
Fellow,
ナーからコメ
Dr.
ントをいただ
Peter
きたいと
Wagner,
思います。
who will be
ドクター・ワグナー、お
commenting.
願いいたします。
So over to you.
Thank you very much. I try to be short to leave some time to answering the questions. Regarding Professor Jimbo's thoughts, I would like to focus on just a few issues to conserve time. One is the NATO role and the US commitment to defend its allies and the role of deterrence in this conflict. I think it's very important to highlight that this is not a conflict within the NATO. So Ukraine is not part of the NATO, and this is a very important issue because it limits the NATO's possible reaction to this conflict. Professor Jimbo asked the questions if the US will be committed to defend other allies in another conflicts, probably in Asia. And I'm sure the United States will be doing this because in Europe, what we see in the last couple of months and the last couple of weeks, that the United States is really not only committed, but resolute in supporting its NATO allies, not only Ukraine, but its Eastern European NATO allies. Probably you're aware of the fact that after 3 or 4 days of the conflict, when Russia invaded Ukraine, NATO activated its so-called NATO reaction force. This is a unit of 40,000 soldiers. It was never activated before for collective defense. It was activated for humanitarian crisis, for crisis management operation, but never ever before collective defense. Even in Hungary, which is not in a direct border with Russia, we are expecting NATO troops arriving to Hungary in the coming weeks. But most of these troops, of these 40,000 troops, will arrive to the Baltic states, to Poland, and to Romania. So I think we have to separate two issues here: U.S. support or Western support to Ukraine in terms of military hardware, which most of this hardware are for defensive purposes, so not to escalate the conflict more. And the other hand, the United States is still and very much committed to the NATO as a military alliance. And even under the threshold of a potential nuclear conflict, it's still, I don't see any question in deploying even US troops and activating all over Europe NATO troops to defend their newborn, let me say, Eastern allies. Professor Jimbo mentioned the question of nuclear policy and nuclear deterrence. I have to admit that in the last 30 years in Europe and within the NATO, we were really shy about discussing this nuclear policy. Only probably in academic circles, this issue came up for discussion, but I'm sure that the public audience in Hungary or in Eastern Europe is not really aware about that NATO has a nuclear policy. Okay, we think this is an American NATO force. This is an American nuclear force. US has nuclear forces, but not NATO. There is this nuclear planning group within the NATO. It was never discussed in Hungary, within the public, and not even between us, because this is completely far from us. And it draws me to the question of the future of deterrence. And this is again something which NATO forgot, I think, in the last 30 years. So we didn't have to practice it. United States was a unipolar hegemon, and he had other issues, counterinsurgency, terrorism, counterterrorism, humanitarian crisis, and now, with this conflict, I think, and NATO politicians and European politicians will have to relearn this behavior, how to work and how to deal with a nuclear-powered opponent enemy. Because until now, I think this will really change the mentality within Europe. Because okay, we had Crimea, which was we call it a hybrid war. We accepted that we can put this war into a category of frozen conflicts, which was well known within the European history of the last 30 years. But now this is really a state-on-state conflict. So I think in the future, NATO and the European countries will behave more directly with this issue, and will be able to form a reliable deterrence policy against Russia. Thank you.
Dr. Wagner, ありがとうございました。
Dr. Wagner, thank you
すでに
very
視聴
much.
者の皆様から多くの質問をいただいております。
We've received
ご質
several
問がある
comments
方は、
from
Zoom で参加されている方は、 チャット機能を用いて質問をお送りく
this
ださい。
webinar through Zoom.
最
Please
初
use
の
the
質
chat
問です。
function to submit your
ロシアと
questions.
ウクライナの平和交渉は実効性があるのかということです。 なぜならハンガリー、失礼しました。ウクライナ側、ゼレンスキー政権側は ロシアへ
The
の経済
Ukrainian
制裁を
Zelensky
解除できないから
government
で、
does
そ
not
うし
have
た
the
場合、アメリ
authority
カ
to
が平和
lift
交渉に加
economic
わる可能
sanctions
性というのがある
against
のかという
Russia.
こ
Is
と
there
で
a
す。
possibility
で
for
こ
the
れは
United
ドク
States
ター・ステッ
to
パーに
join
お答えいただき
the
たいと思います。
negotiations? Dr.
ま
Stepper,
た、
could you
東ヨーロッ
respond
パ、あ
to
るいは
that?
中央ヨーロッ
East
パ
Europe
の視
or
点から
Central European
です
perspective, from such
が、アメリカを
perspective,
どのように評価
how
している
is
か。
US perceived from the
ヨーロッ
Central
パ
or
とアメリ
Eastern
カの
European
戦略という
perspective?
ものは統一されているのだろ
Is
うか。
there alignment
それと
between
もアメ
the
リカとは
strategies of
異なるの
Europe
だろうか。
and the
こ
United
ちらは
States,
先
or
ほ
is the European
どア
strategy
メリカの
different from
核、そしてヨーロッパの
the
核
United
にも
States?
言及いただいた
You
ワグナ
mentioned
ー博
European
士にお答えをいた
nuclear
だきた
and
いと
US
思いま
nuclear
す。
policy. So Dr. Wagner, please take that
まずはこ
question.
の2つに対す
So
る質
let's
問から
take
お答えいただけ
those
ますでし
two
ょうか。
questions
時間の
first.
制限もあります
Due
の
to time
で、短く
constraints,
お願いいた
please
します。
respond briefly. Thank
では、
you.
ドクター・ステッパー、お願いいた
Dr.
します。
Stepper, you go first.
Thank you very much for the question. As far as I can understand, the question is about how the US policy in the region is perceived from Central and Eastern European countries. I would say here in this region, we do not necessarily share the same expectations towards the US approach and US policy in terms of the Ukraine war. I think what we can see now, and of course, it's my personal opinion about the Biden administration's interest in terms of global and world politics. I don't think that the traditional pivot to Asia approach and the major strategic goal of the United States to counter Russia on a global scene has changed much, even in the light of the Ukraine crisis. So from this perspective, what I would expect is that Washington would like to see a relatively quick resolution of the armed conflict with an outcome when we can show a united NATO and a firm commitment to defend our interest in the eastern flank. But again, I think the major goal, the strategic goal of the United States is to see major European players to be able to defend themselves in such cases when their sovereignty is threatened. And what we see so far, the surprising steps from the German government to increase their budget in a very quick and hasty way to reach the 2% goal of NATO threshold, and all the other steps are in favor of US strategic thinking. On the other hand, there were players in the region, especially Poland and the Baltic states, who are really worried about more aggressive Russian behavior. Of course, what we see now seems to prove they were right in the last years, being worrisome about what to expect. But still, there is a distinction. Hardliners and a bit more hawkish approach in eastern and northern part of the eastern flank expects Washington to make more stronger and firm steps in this conflict today, including, for example, the very sophisticated approach to move Polish MiG-29s to the possession of the Ukrainian government. What we see from here in Hungary, that the US is not ready to do such actions in order to escalate the conflict, but they are more interested in a solution which leads to keep, let's say, the dialogue possible with the Russians and reach an outcome which is acceptable for both parties. I think it's it's a bit. I'm worrying about the very worst scenario when we reach a point when either party, or in the worst case, both of the parties, Russians and Ukrainians, have a feeling this war can move into the direction of their favor. I mean, if the Ukrainians have the feeling they have they have very high, very advanced equipment coming from the West constantly, and they have the strategic advantage against the Russians, they won't be interested in peace negotiations. And this goes to the Russians as well. If the Russians are really committed to move forward, it's not good, and it's not the best possible outcome for Hungary.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you
で
very
は、
much.
ドクター・ワ
Then
グナー、よ
Dr.
ろしくお願いします。
Wagner, please go
短
ahead
め
with
にコ
your
メントをお
response.
願いい
And
たしま
again,
す。
brevity would be appreciated.
Thank you. If I'm correct, you are. I hear you and the translation at the same time. So I'm not exactly sure what was you asking, but the answer to the same question. Was that right?
The question was
Yeah.
Sorry. What is the opinion about USA?
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
strategy between the Europe, Hungary, and the United States, united or not?
Mhm. I think the opinion is now that the United States and the NATO is united. So actually we saw a US behavior which was expected before. Since the invasion in Crimea, NATO started to practicing how to move troops fast from Germany or from the United States to the eastern part of the alliance. Every year there were several military exercises, and these exercises continued even when Donald Trump was the president. We also saw some American decision to deploy troops to Europe, extra troops to Europe to bolster the defense of the so-called eastern flank of Europe. So what I see now is that actually those exercises and practices of the last 8 years are come to fruit now, and we see that actually those plans which were established and worked out in the last 8 years are used and introduced now, which helps the NATO and which helps the United States to work with its NATO partners to be more effective with this to face this Russian threat.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much for that. The next question is about Hungary's foreign policy. In Japan, the image was that Hungary was pro-Russia and pro-China, but with regard to Russian incursion into Ukraine, Hungary's foreign policy, will it change because of this, or was it not pro-Russia, pro-China to begin with? If you could address this, please. I wonder who we could ask to answer this question. The other question is Japan's security policy. The Prime Minister said that this is there's a possibility of the largest crisis since the World War. What does that mean? Was the question. In the Pacific region, and Japan's security was discussed by Professor Jimbo. So perhaps we could ask Professor Jimbo to respond. On the Hungarian side, I wonder who will answer this question about the change in foreign policy as a result of this incident. Dr. Grosty, could you answer this question, please?
Shall I go first? Okay, it's an absolutely relevant question. And our Prime Minister 2 weeks ago, when the war started, said that this is not the time to be smart, but the time to be united. And that basically drives Hungarian foreign policy ever since, because Hungary has been backing EU sanctions against Russia. And obviously, due to the severity of the situation, we have to recognize that that kind of hedging strategy that worked in the previous years, which, by the way, all the European countries were doing, regardless how tough they were on Russia in talk, everybody tried to do business with them. Same goes for China. So I think the big question here will be that how strict the dividing lines between the blocks of the West and the rest will be, and what will be possible in the realm of economics and politics. But obviously, the war in Ukraine is somewhat of a game changer in this regard as well. And I'm quite sure, and if I look at what President Macron is doing, if I look at what Chancellor Scholz is doing, everybody is reassessing their relationship with both Russia and China at the moment. It's a bit of a wait and see approach right now to find out in which direction this will go.
ありがとうございました。では、神保教授、よろしくお願いします。
Thank you very much, Professor Jimbo, please. Prime Minister Kishida, in different places, is saying that depending on how things pan out, this will be the largest crisis. Could you unmute yourself? Can you hear me? I'm unmuted. Can you hear me? Am I coming through? Prime Minister Kishida is saying that this could be potentially the greatest crisis after World War II, since World War II. And already it's a nation-to-nation war which has occurred as a result of aggression. And so this is indeed the greatest crisis since World War II. And if the situation deteriorates, what kind of crisis do we envision? Nuclear weapons, the use of nuclear weapons, it may be an escalation that could take place. And if that happens, this without a doubt would be the greatest crisis since World War II. Now, if Russia succeeds, of course, we have to think about the short term and the long term. If Russia sufficiently, without feeling damage and cost of this, successfully invades Ukraine, the unison of the Western countries and intervention and deterrence, what would this mean? It would be the greatest crisis. I don't know what the Prime Minister meant when he said that this is the greatest crisis. You have to ask him personally, but this is my own personal interpretation. Thank you very much, Professor Jimbo. We've overrun the time.
お許しいただければ、あと1問ずつ、お話をいただければと思います。一つは、プーチン大統領が、今回のウクライナ侵攻を、失敗したと見せずにどのように、終わらせるのか。ということです。
In order for President
appearing as a failure, and what does this mean for Russia's foreign policy towards the EU and Ukraine and China? こちらの回答については、
Dr. Wagner, would you like to respond to that? The other question is, why isn't the Western countries deciding on military intervention? And Commandant Nagashima, could you respond to that question from the Japanese perspective? First, Dr. Wagner.
Yeah. So the question is why the Western countries are not participating in a military answer toward this conflict. Well, I think the answer is for me at least.
No, can you answer the first question? So in order for President Putin to avoid projecting an image that he was a failure.
And what does this mean for Russia's foreign policy towards EU, Ukraine, and China?
Well, it's a very complex question. I think I don't have a good answer until we don't know how this conflict will end, because what we see in Russia that the reaction of the public is quite stark, and Mr. Putin will have to face the economic consequences of this conflict as well. There are ongoing negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, and I hope there will be a diplomatic solution to this conflict. Which of course means that both Russia and Ukraine will have to make great sacrifices in their demands. And until now, honestly, it's beyond my imagination that how will Russia would accept this defeat, at least in political sense, what they are facing in Ukraine now. And I think the outcome of these talks and diplomatic discussion dialogue will decide how Russia will continue its foreign policy towards Ukraine and Europe.
Thank you very much. This is about something of which outcome is unknown, so it's not possible to do any analysis. You're very correct, and I don't think we should make any comments based upon prejudice. And I said that I will ask Lieutenant General Nagashima will comment on the Western intervention, but in addition, Dr. Ugroski, can you also comment on the reason why the Western countries are not intervening militarily? First of all, Nagashima-san, nuclear, if we look at NATO, US, European countries, the NATO Treaty Article 5, in other words, collective defense rights. So this is a treaty issue pertaining to Article 5. And in effect, I think the biggest reason is the nuclear issue. And on this front, with intervention from the West, in the end, Kaliningrad, the separated territory, and if nuclear forces are deployed, then from the NATO's perspective, if nuclear forces are deployed, NRF will lose function and the three Baltic states will be cut off from NATO, and that is a deep concern for NATO. And therefore, from such perspective, they cannot directly intervene. But in principle, it's based upon the NATO treaties that prevents them from intervening. Thank you very much. Dr. Ugrosti, please.
I think the West is not intervening because it never promised to intervene. If you look at all the press meetings and briefings that President Zelensky had with the Secretary General Stoltenberg, the Sec Gen always said that we support Ukraine, but Ukraine is not a NATO member state, so the Article 5 commitments don't apply. There were weeks when this was thread like three or four times over and over again. And I think that is also the answer to the question that why the West is not doing anything. NATO is not being attacked at the moment, I have to say, but NATO is not being attacked. Therefore, it's up to the individual member states of what they can do. And I think they all know that what it means if NATO goes to war with Russia. Most probably it wouldn't last that long at all.
Thank you very much for that. War with Russia, NATO countries may be directly exposed potentially, and then Japan is analyzing this as an outsider. So maybe the sense of crisis differs between Japan and the European countries. As Lieutenant General Nagashima says, Ukraine is not a party to NATO. And I think that is what it boils down to. We still have a lot of questions. We've, however, already overrun the time. It's please forgive me for my oversight as moderator. We had very frank answers from the Hungarian side, and Japan has expressed its concerns, and we were able to share our views. This was the first step toward mutual understanding, I think. there are differences in terms of thinking and recognition, but Japan and Europe must cooperate. Otherwise, the world order might be changed through force, and so we cannot deal with this unless we unite. So we should continue to try to understand the thinking in Europe, and we hope that Europe will try to understand our thinking here in Japan. We thank you all for your participation in this discussion for a long time, and to the audience, we thank you as well. IFAT and SPF will continue discussions, and we'd like to communicate our views together. So thank you very much for your participation today. Thank you.